Good morning and good afternoon to all of you. My name is Suda David Wilp, and on behalf of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, I'd like to welcome you to this month's Transatlantic Tuesday. Transatlantic Tuesday is an initiative of GMF's Berlin office where we talk about pertinent issues in the transatlantic relationship. And this week, we're going to talk about, actually this month, we're going to talk about the upcoming midterm election in the US and what it means for transatlantic relations. We're very honored to have board member Congressman Will Hurd with us today. And I'm going to now hand over to my able colleague, Julia de Clerck-Sachsse, who is a visiting fellow in our Brussels office. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you so much, Suda, and a very warm welcome also from me to all of you. We have 4 weeks to go to the US midterm election, an election that is unusually hard to predict this time round. Now, while usually the midterms are a referendum on the president and his first 2 years in office, this year, the midterms are also being cast as a referendum on former President Trump and whether his Trumpist ideas are going to be the future of the Republican Party as well, and what that will mean for the American political landscape. What is more, we also have a number of political issues such as inflation, the economy, the earlier overturning of Roe v. Wade that have really kind of polarized the political debate even more, and keep appending the forecasts on how this election is going to turn out. Now, to discuss some of these issues around the midterms and the political landscape we're currently seeing in the United States, I'm really happy to welcome former Congressman Will Hurd. Thank you so much for being with us today. Will is currently managing director at Allen & Company. You're also a cybersecurity executive, you've been, and also a former undercover CIA agent. Some very interesting things about that in your book as well. Now, you're also here to talk to us a little bit about your book that came out earlier this year, American Reboot, an Idealist Guide to Getting Things Done, where you tackle the issues of polarization and government stagnation. And not only that, but thankfully also point to some ideas about how to tackle these challenges and how to overcome them, something I hope we can discuss also today. Now, having been called the future of the Republican Party while you were in office, I really can think of no better person to discuss also the future of American politics and what the midterms might indicate in that relation. To all of you, as always at GMF, we would like to make this discussion as interactive as we can. So please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A function and I will get to them as well while we're having this conversation. Now, to kick us off, the premise of your book, American Reboot, is that America has become worse at getting things done, that basically the polarization is so strong that it's getting increasingly difficult to tackle the growing number of pressing issues that we need to. Now, arguably looking at the elections right now, at the landscape surrounding the several campaigns, America is becoming more polarized, not less. So tell us a little bit, looking at this environment, how realistic really is it to have this reboot that you advocate, and how realistic is it that we are going to get things done in the upcoming election cycle?
Well, so are we going to get things done in the upcoming election cycle? That's a really big question, and I think I'm probably pessimistic about that. However, what I've been advocating for some time, and what I advocate in the book, it's hard, but it's doable. Why are we polarized in the United States? And it's basically our primary process. Let's take the House of Representatives, 435 members of the House of Representatives, 92% of those seats, right? That's 401 seats are decided in the primary. And the number of people in each congressional seat is responsible for about 750 to 800,000 people. So in those primaries, in a contested primary, meaning in one of these primary elections that there are multiple people on the ballot, only about, on average, this is an average, 60,000 people vote. So that means 30,000 people are deciding 92% of the House seats. That is the only constituency that those elected officials ultimately care about, because a seat is so red, Republican, or so blue, Democrat, that it doesn't matter what happens in November in the general election, because whoever wins the primary is going to win that seat. That's the fundamental problem. And so you have 3% of a congressional district driving the agenda because they're the loudest, and oftentimes they're the craziest. That's the core problem. And the only way you fix that is get more people to vote in primaries. Now, it's hard as someone who is, ran a race. Look, I'm a Black Republican that represented a 72% Latino district. Nobody thought I had a chance in hell in winning. And then when I did one, nobody thought that I could win re-election. How'd I do it? I shut up the places, right? And I fought for votes, and I got new people to come in and vote in the process. That's the secret. And one of the things I learned in business now, look, you definitely, people that are using your product or service, you take care of them, but you're always looking to grow and reduce the group of people that don't use your product or service, right? You want to get more people. And that's where I think the future of the Republican Party is going to be, if we want kind of this conservative thought to drive our country for more than one election cycle, which is just 2 years.
Thanks. Well, you touched on a lot of issues already, so let me drill down on a couple of them. I mean, I think one of the things we're seeing right now is that not just our Republicans and Democrats disagreeing on certain issues, but we're basically having two separate conversations, right? About what the election is about and what the future of America is about. So Democrats are talking a lot about Roe v. Wade, the future of democracy, and Republicans are talking about the economy and inflation. So given that is even more than polarization, that is like two separate political conversations. How do we get these, if we don't even have the same political language, how do we get these two strands to talk to each other again?
Well, look, I think it's so easy to only get fixated on one idea. And the people that are going to win, and the folks that are going to come out of these elections or want to see some thoughtfulness, you got to talk about multiple things at the same time. And so let's take the issue of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Even though about 80% of Americans think that there's the three exceptions should be allowed, right? Life of the mother, rape or incest. This is not a overarching issue that drives people to the polls or cause them to be their number one issue when they go out and vote. Now, this issue, what you're going to see is you're going to see enthusiasm from Democratic voters a little bit higher than what is normal in a primary. In a non-presidential election. Here are the trends that happens when it's a presidential election. Turnout is always higher, and the enthusiasm between Republicans and Democrats are sometimes equal. Democrats a little bit more. When it comes to a non-presidential election, what happens is that enthusiasm amongst Democratic voters dips, and there is an advantage oftentimes for Republican candidates. I think what you're going to ultimately see in a month from now is that because of the Roe v. Wade issue, that is going to see enthusiasm amongst Democrat voters be equivalent or near a presidential election turnout. So that's one point. But there's more nuanced issues that people aren't talking about in public consciousness. I'm from a border town. I represented 820 miles of the border between the U.S. and between Texas and Mexico. You're going to see Latino voters in South and West Texas and places like Nevada turn out in record numbers for GOP candidates, primarily because of a completely ineffective border security and immigration policy by President Biden. And so even though most of the conversation in the news is about the Texas and Florida governors busing people to the East Coast, that is not, when it comes to people on the ground, this is a public safety issue, and Democratic mayors, Democratic city council members are outraged by what has been happening for the last 2 years. So there's a lot of nuance that's happening, and we forget the old adage that all politics are local. And when you focus on all politics being local, you can win. But what we want to do and what the press wants to do and what happens on social media is we want to nationalize everything and look at this national view and lens on some of these local races when there are more nuance happening at the ground. So to you, I don't know if that answers your question, but we're talking, we focus on issues where there's complete disagreement instead of talking about the issues where there's 80% agreement on. If we talk about making sure our kids are educated and then prepared for jobs that don't exist today, you can have more opportunity. However, that doesn't sell. And that doesn't get clicks on social media, and it doesn't foment outrage, which is what a lot of elections are all about now.
Yeah, I mean, there you touch on an interesting issue. Sort of, what are we looking at? Are we looking at the media coverage? Are we looking at the social media hits, or are we looking at votes? I mean, do they translate into the same thing or not? Because what you're just talking about, I mean, you mentioned one issue, which is the immigration sort of busing migrants around the country. That's actually in the polls is seen as not really something that's mobilized voters that much, but it's gotten enormous coverage around the world. So everybody's looking at the US. But the nuance that you're talking about and the local dimension of it, we're not seeing that at all, certainly not where I'm sitting here in Europe. So how do you...
Sure.
How do you sort of find, and why aren't Republican candidates in particular? I mean, I think we're seeing a lot of more polarization. We're seeing these kind of tactics. We're seeing Herschel Walker, we talked about, scandals surrounding a prominent candidate, continuing legal troubles of the former president as well. So why these polarizing tactics if you're telling us that what wins votes is the nuance? And
so those things win votes too, right? And it's easy. What happens is the professional political class, the people that run campaigns, that run races, that do professional fundraising, they want to do the same thing in as many places they can possibly get. And so that's where you get a lot of cookie cutter campaigns. And so look, for every Herschel Walker, I can give you a Governor DeWine in Ohio, who's a reasonable, rational, normal guy. And guess what? He's winning in Ohio when the GOP Senate candidate could potentially lose. Ohio is one of those seats that is probably the Democrats' best chance in flipping a Republican Senate seat. But the governor is going to have a cakewalk, right? And so this is, you can look at candidates in a place like, there were some in New Hampshire. The gubernatorial candidate in Nevada is a sheriff. He's a fairly thoughtful guy. So there's examples. You have a Senate candidate in Colorado. He has an up road, a big hill to climb to beat the incumbent Democrat, but he's narrowing the margin, and he's a normal, rational guy. And so there are examples, but the media loves a good story about a person being crazy. The infatuation with Donald Trump and his influence on the Republican Party. Of course, he has an influence on the Republican Party. He's still probably the most popular Republican there is in the country. But that doesn't mean that there's not a way that he can be beat, or that this brand of what I would call authoritarianism has to continue to permeate. It's still going to exist, right? But if social media determined elections, Bernie Sanders would be president because he has a larger social media footprint, I think, than most elected officials. Stacey Abrams would have been governor in Georgia, and Beto O'Rourke would have been senator or president or governor. Right, like social media does not always reflect the realities and what people on the ground, but it's an easy thing for us to talk about because that's what's trending on Twitter, or what cable news talking heads like to focus on.
So let's take for a moment sort of a perspective beyond the media and the current focus and so on, and let's project. I mean, I already said in my intro, these elections are actually proving to be more difficult to predict as I guess is a trend with election these days. But if we're looking at current polling, the most likely scenario we're seeing is a Democratic Senate and for the Republicans to take the House. So let's play with that scenario for a moment. And given sort of your advocacy of more center of the road politics, is that a perspective that you could see? Will there be more bipartisan cooperation going forward? And what would be the issues?
No, absolutely not. It's going to get worse, right? Like you're going to see the partisanship get worse. And so let's talk about the next month. I really think there's 8 states so the House is going to flip. Republicans are going to take the House. The question becomes, how big is the margin? Why does that matter? Kevin McCarthy is most likely to be the Speaker of the House. It seems as if today he has the support of the Freedom Caucus. The Freedom Caucus are some of the extreme Republicans in the House that have grown over time and are pretty loyal. It's fascinating. They were super anti-Trump in 2016, and now they're some of the greatest Trump loyalists in the House. That block is the group of people that ultimately led to John Boehner a number of years ago having to step down as Speaker of the House. So the greater the margin of Republican victories in the House, increases likelihood that Kevin McCarthy is Speaker. So that's point one. However, the Freedom Caucus is still going to have an influence in how the Republican House decides to move forward. So that's the House. We'll get back to that in a second, what that means after November. On the Senate, there's 8 states that matter: Ohio, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Pennsylvania. Those 4 states, Republicans must hold. It looks like, Pennsylvania and Ohio are the question marks. Depending on what you look at polling in Pennsylvania, right now, polling average has Dr. Oz, the Republican candidate, losing by 6 points. But these are 4 seats that have to be held. And then the other 4 states, Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, and New Hampshire, Republicans have to flip. Now, the most likelihood is that Nevada is the one that could potentially flip. So if Republicans lose one of those seats that must be held, and we pick only one up that we have to flip, then it's going to be a push. So those are kind of the 8 states to watch. Ohio and Nevada are unique. So let's assume this thing that you mentioned happens, right? Democrats control the Senate, Republicans take the House. November and December. November is going to be consumed with elections of leadership. And this is also going to be on the Democratic side. Does Speaker Pelosi stay? Does she become the minority leader? Does somebody else come in? So there's going to be leadership debates, and that's going to be fueled, and you're going to see knives coming out and who supports who. And so there's going to be political drama in both the Republican and Democratic side. Then Republicans are, and then you have to pass. You're going to have to pass a budget in December in the lame duck. Will that be able to happen? All right. Oh, excuse me. It's not a budget. You have to pass appropriations. You got to actually fund the government, which that runs out December 16th. Then you're going to have a lot of Republicans who have already said they're looking to impeach Joe Biden the way Democrats impeach Donald Trump. The reason is going to probably be something around the border, potentially Afghanistan. And then you're going to look at potential impeachments against Secretary Mayorkas, who's the head of Homeland Security, because of the crisis at the border. So that's going to consume the beginning of a Republican House. And then the economy is going to get worse. So all of the problems that can easily be blamed on Democrats and Republicans, Democrats and President Biden, now are going to get thrown in the lap of House Republicans not being willing to get anything done. That's going to be the environment in early and mid 2023, which is going to set an environment for 24. So your question was, is that we're going to see more bipartisanship happen? Probably not, because unfortunately, Republicans are not going to learn their lesson from this election, which is, and neither side learned the lesson from the 2020 election. The lesson on the 2020 election was, don't be a jerk and don't be a socialist. And then a lot of Republicans try to be bigger jerks, and Democrats became bigger socialists. Anyways, I didn't mean for a long answer to that, but these are complicated questions.
No, and it seems like in a way that Republicans are in a bit of a bind, and maybe you can tell us, I mean, you've written very much about the future of the Republican Party, because as you say, if the strategy continues to be polarizing, possible impeachment, a lot of the things that I hear in DC as well, non-cooperation, then the blame will actually eventually fall back on them and not only on President Biden. Whereas if they cooperate, then Biden has a successful second term of his presidency. So,
but it goes back to that first point. Most of these people are only talking to 30,000 people in their districts, right? And so when you look at their, one of the things you learn when you're in the CIA and you're recruiting spies and stealing secrets, you always got to understand people's motivations. What is the motivation of many of these people? They want to continue to get reelected, and the way they get reelected is because of a very small group of voters in their districts. Now, the Democratic Party is not going to take lessons away either, because despite all these things you read about in the newspaper, why can't Raphael Warnock, if 10 years ago, Herschel Walker would be losing by 30 points. Why is that not the case now, right? And part of this is the issue of making, like, why is the Democratic Party not being able to capitalize on these issues? And because they're pretty terrible on a lot of topics. And so that's another side of you're not going to see the Democratic Party do some soul searching, and President Biden recognized some of the problems and missteps he's made that has created an environment that has made it hard for Democrats to capitalize on what would be on elections with candidates who are significantly flawed.
So you've said that Republicans haven't learned their lesson so far from the 20. Do you think they will learn the lesson before the next presidential elections? And what are some of those lessons? I mean, outline to us, and also to the audience a little bit about where you see the future of the party. What do Republicans need to do now if they want to move away from this kind of dysfunction? So
it starts with Donald Trump. Donald Trump lost the House, he lost the Senate, and he lost the White House, right? The election was not stolen, it was lost because Donald Trump proved incapable of growing the number of people that would vote for him. He has a hard, solid, let's call it 30% of the Republican primary voters that would ultimately vote for him. And if you take a state like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, if Donald Trump in 2020 would have won the same number of votes of all the Republican candidates for the House, he would have won those states and he would have been president. And so this was about, he was not able to grow the party and take advantage of some of the opportunities that flawed policies by Democrats have provided. So unfortunately, most politicians think the last battle, they use the same tactics, techniques, and procedures of the last battle to fight the next battle. And I believe whoever recognizes what the future opportunity is can be successful. And whoever does that is going to also create a movement. Why did you start seeing more people try to act the way Donald Trump acted? Because he was successful. And so that breeds other people doing it. But that's not turning out well for everybody. That may have turned out well for people to win Republican primaries, right? Oh, and by the way, we got to talk about how in many of these primaries, the Democratic Party spent millions of dollars reinforcing and supporting some of these crazy Republicans because they wanted to run against the crazy Republicans in the general election, right? If you do believe that these people are a threat to democracy, then you can't play these tricks and then cry about it and be like, oh my God, look how terrible this is. Well, you help contribute to it. And so one of the lessons Republicans have to learn is we have an opportunity to engage in communities of color, with women with a college degree who live in the suburbs, and people under the age of 35. When we make things a competition of ideas, we can win. When we make it a competition of personalities, it makes it harder in order to win. And again, Ohio is probably the best example. There's a number of House seats I could point to that are examples of this. Now, not everybody is doing this, but I think that's actually where the opportunity is, because there's a lot of Democratic voters that are frustrated with the Democratic Party and wish that there was a rational, normal Republican that they could vote for, and you can see a shift. We saw this similarly in the 1980 elections in the United States when Ronald Reagan won. The number of Democrats that were so frustrated with the presidency of Jimmy Carter, you were able to see, and Ronald Reagan was able to take advantage of that. That's a potential opportunity in 2024 if there's someone that's willing to do the hard work and sees that opportunity.
Great.
And everything I'm talking about is hard. Okay, look, most politicians are lazy. They want to do the least amount of work possible, and they're going to talk to the people that are most likely to vote. And so they don't want to put the hard work in talking to the folks to everyone, because it takes 3 times the amount of effort.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's certainly what we're seeing in the current political environment. Things are getting harder. Now, here at GMF, we obviously focus a lot on transatlantic relations. And so I'm going to turn it over to our audience. I've already seen a few questions come in. But before I do that, can you speak to us a little bit about foreign policy, arguably one topic that isn't highly polarized, but we've seen actually certainly on Ukraine, broad bipartisan agreement. How do you see things going forward? At the same time, the geopolitical environment is getting increasingly polarized and dangerous. So tell us a little bit about how you assess foreign policy going forward.
Sure. And look, my basics, when I go back to what should U.S. foreign policy be, it should be real simple. Your friends should love you, and your enemies should fear you, right? And so Europe and the transatlantic relationship has been one of the most successful partnerships in the history of partnerships. We can talk about NATO specifically. 70 years of peace and prosperity in Europe was good for everybody. And unfortunately, the isolationist vision, and I can make an argument over the history of America. America has been more isolationist than it hasn't been. And then when you look at politics in the United States, the political is not a line anymore. It's a horseshoe. And the people on the edges are closer to each other than they are in the middle, right? So the nuts and the fringe are closer to each other than not. And that's where you see this isolationism. Now, that's still going to exist and have to deal with. But when it comes to an issue as like Ukraine, on the history of Ukraine, the opposing party has always been supportive of Ukraine. When under President Obama did not want to send certain kinds of weapons to help the Ukrainians. It was Republicans in the House, many of the same ones that are about to come in power, that push that and push that funding through. When Donald Trump was doing whatever he was doing with Ukraine, it was Democrats in the House that push and encourage that support of Ukraine. I think we're going to see the same thing when it comes to on the House side. Senate, if Democrats get the Senate continues the same. But when you look at the people that are going to be driving policy in the House for Republicans, it's Mike McCall, who's going to be the chairman of Foreign Affairs. He understands. Probably many people on this call have met with Mike McCall. Mike Turner, who's going to be the head of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Mike Turner was the head of some transatlantic parliamentarian group for a number of years, and it feels like every European parliamentarian knows who Mike Turner is. He's going to be driving that. You have the chairman of the Military Affairs Committee is someone who recognizes the need to have partnerships. So you're going to see, when it comes to nuts and bolts and things getting done, I think you continue to see support to Ukraine. My fear is actually with our allies and friends in Europe. When you see the lines at the pump in France because of the yeah, that is that going to happen more, right? Is we all know about winter coming and how that's going to impact, and how the price of heating your home is going to increase because of the need for Russian energy sources. That's going to be something I think that has more of an effect on what happens in Ukraine, and which is another reason why all of our allies should be doing everything we can to help the Ukrainians win the war. And winning the war means pushing the Russians out. Oh, and by the way, Vladimir Putin is at the most vulnerable he's ever been.
Right. I want to take some questions also from the Q&A, and maybe just tying up to what you just said on foreign policy. There's a question whether there is any issue where we can most likely see change if Republicans win the House. Is there any issue where you think there would be a shift in current American foreign policy?
Shifts in current American foreign policy. Look, I think the issue that there's two issues in U.S. foreign policy that doesn't get much focus, and it has a tangential impact on transatlantic relationships. I think it's our relationship with the broader Middle East. And I think the OPEC plus decisions is a good example of that, of how our Sunni Arab partners are concerned about what can happen. And again, it's hard to change that because the foreign policy is still primarily executed from the executive branch. So it's going to be hard to see that. Another thing that I'm concerned with is our neighbor with Mexico. The U.S., Mexico, Canadian trilateral relationship is one of the most important in the world. We need to modernize our trading relationship. We need to be more interconnected. We're less interconnected than Europe is. We're less interconnected than Asia is, two of the other larger international trading blocs. So that's an issue, but you're going to see a lot more conversations and question about and second guessing of the administration, because you're going to have the Republican House. What's going to happen is you're going to see a lot of oversight. So every week there's going to be some high profile hearing where a senior executive branch official is going to have to come back and explain things. You're going to see a lot about what actually happened in Afghanistan and the decision leading up to that. And this is another reason why you're still going to see support about Ukraine, because I think you're going to want to see people want to criticize the administration for not doing enough, which is how we're going to push it. So could any kind of trade agreements that may or may not have been being debated, could they pass the House? I think that's going to be a tough question about whether some of those things could be finalized over the next 2 years. And that's an area where I'd probably put the biggest question mark.
Right. How much space will there be for any foreign policy discussions, given the sort of growing polarization we're going to see and sort of a lot of the impeachment questions and so on?
Look, I sometimes when it comes to foreign policy, I go back to the UN in the 90s, right? The UN in the 90s and the early 2000s, a country like India was still part of the, talking about the non-aligned movement, would go up and criticize America, but then they're negotiating probably one of the most expansive bilateral relationships in the history of those two countries, right? And so a lot of the conversation around foreign policy versus what actually happens, here are some agreements. The threat of the Chinese government to the world order, there's agreement on that. The fact that we were able to pass the CHIPS Act in this super hyper-partisan environment, the threat of technologies to the world, right? And I say that so broadly because it's viewed that broadly. Some would say it's cybersecurity. I think it's more specific. And so there is agreement. So when you look at what is the #1 foreign policy challenge of the United States, and that is the Chinese government trying to surpass the United States of America as a global superpower. That's not my opinion. That's what the Chinese government has said themselves in English in their own documents, okay? And so for us, there's agreement on that overarching issue. There's gonna be a lot of debates, but I think when it comes to that, when it comes to what happens in Iran, this is probably one area that in the next 6 or 9 months, a policy is going to have to formulate. It's fascinating to me that the far right and the far left can start becoming to have some agreement on Iran when the far left is now questioning whether you give $1 billion to the Iranian government through the Iran deal when they're doing what they're doing to women at a time when women are leading these protests in Iran. You're seeing the brakes potentially being put on Iran deal, not because of the right, but because of the left. And the left and the right are seeing with some more agreement on a challenge that has probably been one of the most clear disagreements in foreign policy between Republicans and Democrats. So I actually think that's a fascinating opportunity, even though we're going into what's probably going to be a super hyperpartisan environment, political environment.
Yeah, speaking to that, one of the questions I have in the Q&A is, would Ron DeSantis improve the chances for the GOP, probably for the next presidential elections?
Thinking about 24 when we haven't gotten through 22 is a fool's errand, and because the environment is going to be different than what we're thinking about now. It's funny when people do polling on a Joe Biden versus Donald Trump election right now. Well, the election's not right now. The environment is going to be completely different. We don't know who these two people are. Look, I am not a fan of the former president, and so I think there's a lot of other candidates that can have a better chance. But I always remind people, at this time in the last presidential election, everybody thought that Jeb Bush was the likely Republican nominee, right? The previous election cycle, everybody thought, I'm gonna throw a name out that many people on this phone call probably don't know, but it was Scott Walker. Scott Walker was the governor of Wisconsin. Everybody thought he was going to be the next big thing. And so I don't know. I served with Governor DeSantis in the House. But I think the question was, is that going to be an improvement over Donald Trump? Yes, that would. But I think there's many others that could as well.
Would you consider running?
Look, my political career is probably not over, and when it comes to campaigns, you got to have willingness, you got to have ideas, you got to have resources, you got to have infrastructure, and you got to have a moment to meet. And if those things were aligned, then I would evaluate an opportunity to serve my country again. And so it's great that some people think that I could or should. But there's a lot of issues that go into making that decision.
I have one more question from the Q&A, which is, what are the areas where Democrats and Republicans could cooperate regardless of how the election turns out? And you already mentioned a few: tech, China, obviously, which are foreign policy, but also domestic policy. But what are others that we can look at?
And let me define some terms real quick. And I should have done at the beginning. When people say Republicans and Democrats, what does that actually mean, right? What do people mean when you say the Republican Party? Now, most people, when they say the Republican Party, it is an amalgamation of people that are in elected office, or more specifically, the senior officials that have the highest name ID, right? And that is a valid way to look at the parties. But that leaves out a group of people. And that's people that vote for those parties or that are open to vote for those parties. And when you take that broader view, there's a lot that the electorate agrees on. Let's take a contentious issue like immigration. there are a number of points within immigration that Republicans and Democratic voters can agree on. If a piece of legislation got to the floor, you would see it pass, and that requires our leaders in the Republican and Democratic Party to bring those things forward. Again, something contentious like the issue of abortion. You know, there's wide agreement on those three exceptions, like we talked about before. When it comes to guns, we haven't talked about that. Doing things like having the age to purchase a rifle being the same age to purchase a handgun, which is 21. There's overwhelming agreement on that. And so when you look at that broader view, there are many things. But technology and dealing with the threat of China are some agreement. We have seen in emergency economic crises that politics gets put aside. The fact that the number of COVID packages that happened under Donald Trump were passed, you know, we forget about that. So when in moments of extreme crisis, we're able to get things done. I just want us to show a little bit of problem solving when there's not a crisis, and do something in advance. More specifically, I think there could be in this next cycle, if Democrats show a willingness to do some things around immigration, which sounds wild with border crisis being a issue, but so many Democrats want to see that thing being solved.
Great, thanks so much. We're almost out of time, but just as a concluding questions, as you know, one of the reasons a lot of Europeans are looking at the midterms right now is also to get a sort of indication of where is America going. And, you know, behind closed doors here in Brussels, you hear more and more people saying, well, but how do we work with the Americans? Can we even rely on them? We don't know where America is going. There's so much uncertainty in the world, but also when it comes to American leadership. So what is your message to Europeans regarding the future of American policy in the world and American leadership?
Look, democracy is hard. It always has been hard. It always will be hard. I remind people about, why is America called an experiment? Because 247 years ago, when we started this thing, nobody thought it was going to work. It had been 1,800 years for a previous democracy, for a democracy to have been on the planet. That was Rome. And Julius Caesar screwed that up when he became emperor. Right. And so my thing is that what America has to do, we don't have to fight on the beaches of Normandy. We don't have to fight on the plains of Concord. We don't have to fight in the fortresses of Mazar-e Sharif in order to address and tackle the challenges that we as a country is faced with. And so I actually, and getting out and interacting with students, interacting with population, being around the country and seeing where most Americans are, they want to see another 247 years of peace and prosperity and American quality of life increasing and helping to uplift humanity. And so I think at the core, that's what people want. It's going to get messy. What I would tell people, stop reading all the major news in the United States, because all it is going to give you raise your blood pressure. But follow those people that are being thoughtful, encourage the kind of behavior you want to see. And when it comes time, was it Churchill who said that, you know, America will always do the right things after we've gone through all the other options? People that are coming into power, even in this contentious environment, recognize and understand the importance of having allies. And people recognize that the only way that we're going to counter the most important national security threat to the United States, the government of China, is we have to have friends and allies to do that. And so I think that is what's going to ultimately drive people. And that's not what you're seeing. And that's not what's reflecting, but I can tell you, seeing stuff on the ground, that is different.
Well, thanks so much for first of all, this sort of tour d'horizon, if not tour de force, on sort of American policies, what we're seeing in the midterms, from the very details on which states to watch to a sort of broader view of what are the issues we should focus on. And also for kind of finishing on a high note, I'm glad we were able to kind of, after all the talk of polarization and opposition, to really finish at looking at the things that can be done, and that also hopefully the transatlantic relationship can address. So
Look,
thank you for being
So you know, one quick thing, if people care, look, I put out a newsletter every other week where I try to give a different take on what's happening. You can do it on my website, willbehurd.com. But I also poll people. And the last question I asked folks was, is America's best days ahead of us or not? Right? And I was shocked at more than 50%, 56% said absolutely yes. And there was about 30% that said they didn't know. And that means there's still a lot of people that can be convinced and truly believe that our best days ahead of us. And I think that's probably the same in all of our allied countries. And so, like I said, I do, it's going to get worse before it gets better, but better days are ahead of us.
That's a wonderful note to finish on. Thanks again for being with us today for a great debate. Thanks to everybody who submitted questions, and please join us again soon for Transatlantic Tuesdays.